this incident, Paul is talking to a group of people called Epicureans. The Epicureans absolutely did not believe that people rose from the dead. That was part of their creed. So the reaction that he gets here is very straightforward. I think it's a reaction that is normal in 21st century culture. And it's this: some people sneered, some people wanted to hear some more, and a few people, and it was a few, actually believed it, and it changed things. So I've written about this at length, not as much. There's a guy called N.T. Wright who has a book on the resurrection, which if you really want to get into this, it's about 1,000 pages. It's even more, they shall remain nameless, but someone just referred to me a book that they were given on Job, which they said was turgid, so they just jumped to the end. Well, jumping to the end of this book, you know, Jesus rose from the dead. I've written a book on who Jesus is, and I've got a chapter in it on the resurrection, a lot of what I'm going to say just now. If you'd like a free copy, and this is a Scotsman saying this, so this is a revelatory moment, then just ask me and I'll give it to you. First one to ask. The important thing is this, that for Christians, it's the absolute center. It's the beginning and the center of the Christian faith. So Augustine says this: the leading truth they professed is that Christ rose from the dead and first showed in his own flesh the immortality of the resurrection which he promised should be ours. Yaroslav Pelikan says this: if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, nothing else matters. If Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, nothing else matters. So what would Paul say? I mean, what we've got here is not his whole speech. It's, if you like, a summary of his brief. And it's simply this. First of all, he would say, I agree, resurrections don't happen. That's true. We accept that as a basis. But then he says, this is the first proof because it's so extraordinary. That's the point. This is something that is not normal. You get lots of religious people at Easter going, oh, do you know, it's all about, you know, flowers budding and the promise of new life and spring. No, it's not. This is not, it's not about that. If resurrections were normal, it would be me like me saying, Jesus is the Son of God because he got better from illness. I occasionally suffer from man flu, and for those of you who are not men, this is an incredibly serious condition that you think you are never going to recover from. But you do recover from it. You don't go, oh, well, that was a miracle. You know, that just proves, you know, it proves everything. No, but if you were dead, that really, really does change everything. Second thing Paul would say, Jesus really did die, unlike the Muslim hadiths say he didn't die. Other people have this idea of a swoon theory. I mean, he was flogged, he was nailed to a tree, he was stabbed in the side, he was covered in spices, he was wrapped up in a shroud, and then he woke up, rolled away the stone, and was fine. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Paul would have said also that Jesus was really buried. Buried in the sense of first century burial, which if you were a rich person, you would have your own tomb, which was a cave. And this man called Joseph of Arimathea did have that. The body of Jesus was taken there. It was a family tomb for wealthy people. It was sealed with a massive stone. And that seal aspect is hugely important. The women watching from a distance wanted to dress the body, but couldn't do so because their Jewish religion said you can't even dress a body on the Sabbath. So they waited until the Sunday morning. Number 4, Paul would have said that a Roman guard was put on the tomb. There were rumors. Jesus said he would rise from the dead. It was requested that a Roman guard be put on the tomb to prevent the body being stolen and say, look, he really did rise from the dead. And again, that's hugely significant. They realized the importance. Number 4, Paul would have said that we have eyewitness accounts of the resurrection. The Gospels, which Paul would not have had, but he certainly would have met the authors and he certainly would have had the information. It is only later on that the Gospels are written down. And that is because the authors of the Gospels were still alive at this point. I think also what's incredibly important here, and forgive me for being offensive, I realize how sensitive so many subjects are. I find, by the way, just as a general comment, that if I don't offend you, you should be offended because it means I don't really care about you. But this was an offensive comment, an offensive way of things. In this law, in this culture, women as witnesses were not deemed to be believable. Or if they were, their testimony was deemed to be worth half that of a man. And so it is highly unusual to have an account of something which, if it were made up, has women as the primary witnesses. And here is what happened, because it was the women who were the first witnesses. I mean, it's very interesting that one of the responses here is a woman named Damaris, who was almost certainly a businesswoman and quite an influential woman in this culture, which again was unusual. She's one of the ones who believed. Now, these accounts were given. And again, there's a very interesting aspect of these accounts. People say you've got the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you look at the accounts of the death and resurrection of Christ, they do appear to be contradictory. And I remember thinking that when I read them, and then I read somebody who put them all together and explained how it was possible, and I just thought that was great. I thought it was really, really interesting. And actually, the fact that they are different accounts is not a proof that they are wrong. It's the other way around. So let me put this in a very simple legal way. And again, it has to be simple because I'm fairly ignorant of this kind of stuff. But I don't know if this applies here, but in Scotland in law, we have something called the Mirror of Doctrine. And the Mirror of Doctrine means this. Let's take the current issue of the day, sexual assault. Let's say someone accuses somebody of sexual assault. There are no witnesses, which is a huge problem. There's no physical evidence. That's also a huge problem. It's his word against hers or vice versa, whatever. But let's say that there are four women come and accuse someone of sexual assault. The police have to take that much more seriously, and much more likely that the procurate fiscal, as we call them, would bring charges on that basis. But if those four people, those four witnesses came and told exactly the same story, then under the Mirror of Doctrine, it would be dismissed. Because the likelihood of four people giving identical stories without having consulted is so improbable. Now, if you have four people coming independently who haven't consulted together, that's different. If you have four people consulting together, it tends to be a conspiracy. And so what's happened here is you have four different versions. They differ in some aspects, but not so as to be irreconcilable. But that actually makes them more believable. If you had an account which was word for word the same from everybody, then it actually is, from a historical point of view, and actually from a legal point of view, it's less believable. Paul, for example, would have known the couple who were on the road to Emmaus, probably a married couple. This is later on in the Gospel of Luke, who gave an account of what happened to them when they had met the risen Jesus. Paul, I think, would have said, I'd been to the tomb. I'm pretty sure he would have been to the tomb. He was in Jerusalem. I'd been to the tomb and it was empty. Was the body stolen? Paul would have said, yes, I believe that. Because initially, he killed people or was part of an arrest squad who believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. What would Paul have known? He would have known, for example, that Roman soldiers did not sleep on duty. The soldiers were bribed to say, we actually fell asleep and someone came and stole the body. If you were a Roman soldier and you fell asleep on duty, you were dead, you were executed. That would not have happened. Besides which, the idea of another one was they went to the wrong tomb. Well, if they went to the wrong tomb, you just go to the right one and produce the body. Paul would also have said, I met the disciples. I hated them. I hated what was then called, it wasn't called Christianity, it was called the Way. He said, I hated the Way. I was involved in the first killing of them. I stood and I took their coats and applauded as we stoned the first martyr to death, Stephen. And he would have said, it got to me, it concerned me, it pricked me. Why could people die for something that was false? Now that can happen, and it does happen. But were all these people deluded, and how could they die in such peace? He would have said, Acts 26, as he did say, I met Jesus. Pretty dramatic encounter. Paul on the road to Damascus doesn't really happen to many people. In fact, I don't know anyone that's happened to. Well, no, that's not true. I know one lady, a Buddhist lady, who is very, very opposed to Christianity. And one day she woke up and she said that she saw Jesus at the end of her bed. We had an interesting conversation, but there's no doubt at all that I've met other people who've had dreams and so on, but it's very, very unusual. But Paul said, I did. Another indication is, for those of you who know the Jewish faith, the Sabbath was like absolute. And to change the Sabbath was a phenomenal thing. And they changed the Saturday to the Sunday to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And then I think Paul would have said to these guys in Athens, look, we're still here. The Christian church, you keep trying to get rid of it. It hasn't happened. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, there are 5 times in world history where the church has gone to the dogs, and each time the dogs have been eaten. And I think that it's just still fascinating that there are at least 2 billion people who would at least outwardly profess that they believe that somebody rose from the dead. Now, numbers are not everything. I know a lot of people who believe that Elvis is still alive and working in a chip shop in Manly, but that doesn't mean that it's true, the number of people who believe it, but it's still a factor. Maybe, let me just check my time, because I don't want Peter standing up and saying, yeah, he's holding 2 fingers to me in the right way. So 2 minutes. Okay, look, there's a reason that personally I wouldn't wear a crucifix with Jesus on the cross, because he's not on the cross anymore. He's risen from the cross. The cross is empty. And I think there are practical implications of that. I think when you've witnessed and seen death, I've just been reading Bill Bryson's book on the body, which is fascinating. But at the end, it has this most depressing message, and it's just simply this. You die, you rot, that's it. It was good while it lasted. And that's literally what he says. I'm going, really? Is that all? Is that all there is? And I think the resurrection tells us that that's not all there is. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Well, why are you guys doing your jobs then? For money? Is that it? Well, that's no use, because you're not going to take any of it with you. None of you are going to build a pyramid. And if you are, please don't build it in West Sydney in the floodplain. You know, it's not going to last. But what's the point of it all? Why do we think about these things? And I would suggest that there's a sense in which the resurrection is the hardest thing to believe, but also one of the most important. I've been at deathbeds of people who knew that it was the end, and yet it wasn't. I remember when my father-in-law died, and I'll leave you with this one. You imagine a remote Scottish island, and this is remote, you know, like next stop, Iceland and the North Pole. And it's windy and it's wet, and we buried my father-in-law in the cemetery. The custom was at the time, the men only would carry the coffin to the graveside. There would only be a handful of women. And I remember there were several hundred men from the island, all there, all dressed in black. It's a very solemn, dreary, dark thing. And this old minister with a dog collar and everything else, he's standing there. And I just couldn't believe what he said. He went, "Ah, well, boys, ah, well, I'm looking around this graveyard and I'm telling you this, there's going to be some party here on the day of the resurrection." And I just thought the idea of these guys partying at all was amusing to me. But I just thought, what a lovely thought. What a lovely way of describing what the resurrection is. I believe that. I may be nuts, but I do believe it. And I think within each one of us, there is a sense of what I would call the eternal, and that we are not just a blob of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another. And I think the resurrection is the key historical fact that demonstrates that.
Well, thank you very much, David. This is the book that David's written, A Magnificent Obsession. Do you want to tell us about the title? It's a fascinating title.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I've got this.
Yeah, you got your right.
Yeah, I'll tell you what it was. You'll have heard of Christopher Hitchens. Well, he wrote a book called God Is Not Great. And I read the book and I wanted to sue him for a wrong title, misselling, because it wasn't a book about God at all. It was a book about religion. And then there was a Christian guy called Dinesh D'Souza in America who wrote a book, Why Christianity is Great, which was really Why America is Great. And I just banged my head off the wall with that one. So I thought, I'm going to write a reply. And then it took me ages. I was just thinking about it, and I wrote it in a form of letters. And the title comes about from this, because the BBC used to have a program called Everyman. And in a day when they did real documentaries, they went and sent a reporter to live with a group of Amish in Montana. And they did this program, I think you can still get it on YouTube, called How to Get to Heaven in Montana. It's one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen, because this woman just lived with these people. And what had happened was the older Amish, German-speaking, very traditional, Mennonites actually they were. The pastor died, and his children and some of the younger Amish, in Amish terms, went wild. Like they went to the cinema, and things like that. And some of them went to a place where they became, inverted commas, born-again Christians. So they came back, and they still wanted to live in the community because they loved the community. And there was the whole film was about this clash between the Hochdeutsch, the High German Amish, and the young people who were kind of the evangelicals. And it was just an amazing thing to watch. But at one point, the leader of the evangelicals was the pastor's son, and the beard, the whole works. And the interviewer asked him, you seem really into Jesus. What's all this about? I said, what does Jesus mean to you? And I never forget, I was just a teenager, and I remember seeing his eyes fill with tears, and he went, Jesus, he's my everything. He's my magnificent obsession. So 25 years later, when I wrote a book about Jesus, I just took the title.
All right, thank you very much. Now, the way questions work here is that you just text them into the number that you'll see on the screen or the sheet. So we've got a little bit of time. We'll give David a little chance to grab his breath. So you can send a question in or just through the chat function. And at the same time, if you wanted just to scan the QR code there and fill in the details so you can find out about future city legal events. David, just while we're giving some people to think of a question, and maybe Todd will go around in a moment and pick up any questions that have come from the floor. There's at least one there I can see, number 2. Next week in Canberra, you're going to be interacting with Professor Nick Aroney, who's a Professor of Constitutional Law from Brisbane University of Queensland. Do you want to just give us a little bit of a teaser for that? What are you going to be talking about?
Well, probably what I said at the beginning. I actually think, I didn't think this would be the case. I think a key cultural issue in Australia over the next couple of years is going to be the place of law and how law is. And my argument will be that if we have moved away from the basic, and I would say they were Christian foundations, so people might want to dispute that, from the basic foundations of law, I suspect we're not going to end up with law, we're going to end up with anarchy. So we're going to move towards what used to be called in Stalinist Russia, law by telephone. So Stalin would just phone up a judge and say, this is the result I want. And I think this is actually going to be a key issue, so I'm going to look at that.
Okay. All right. We've got some questions here to start with. So you're right?
Yep, go ahead.
Ready to go? It's a fascinating question here. If God is in control, why were there three so different reactions from those hearing Paul say exactly the same thing? That is, some sneered, some asked for more, and some believed and followed Paul or Jesus. What?
Yeah.
Well, can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want God to be in control, that's fine, and He is. But God doesn't compel belief. Otherwise, I mean, I would say to teenagers, sometimes I go into a school and I'll say, do you know what? If I were God, I could create a world in which you felt no pain, had no bad relationships, had no suffering whatsoever. Would you want that? And they go, oh, yeah, I want that. And say, okay, I'm going to create a world in which you're a chair, because a chair doesn't suffer from existential angst, doesn't feel pain, doesn't wish it was a couch, and all that kind of stuff. And they say, oh, no, I don't want that. You want to be human. Well, what does it mean to be human? To be human means to be able to think, to be able to feel, to be able to love. If you are compelled to love, how is that love? And if you are given freedom of thought, but it's a bit like one of the legal issues at the moment is compelled speech. So I am told that you have to refer to something in this way, even though you know it's not true. Well, how does that work?
If you were compelled, if you went back to Scotland, you were compelled in that way?
Oh, I wouldn't do it.
You wouldn't do it?
No, I wouldn't do it.
So you'd go to jail?
No, yeah, I'm not going to. Look, the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion, in other words, you cannot compel people to believe. So even my kids, I would never say to my kids, you have to believe or I'm going to disown you. That would be bizarre. I would tell them what I believe to be the truth and ask them to think about it and come to it for themselves. But the idea that you can compel someone to believe, it's not belief. So, there's a lovely, there's a Viking tale called the Orkney Saga. And it's just got these great names, just heavy metal names. Eric Bloodaxe and Thorfinn Skullsplitter. Imagine if you were a lawyer called that. So Eric Bloodaxe and Thorfinn Skullsplitter go to Orkney with their ships, and they say to the Earl of Orkney, we want you to become Christians because we're Christians. This is not a high point in Christian evangelism, by the way. And if you don't, we'll steal your cattle, rape your women, kill your children, and burn all your houses. And the saga just finishes, and so all Orkney was baptized. Well, I'm sorry, that's not Christian evangelism. That's, the idea that you can force people is a mistake. And so what Paul does here is he presents the case, says to people, think about it for yourself, and you're going to get different reactions. If you're demanding that God be so in control that he compels everyone's reaction, then all we are is we're just emojis in a sim game. We're not human, and I think we are human.
What was the quote you gave us before about lumps of carbon floating in a meaningless existence?
Yeah,
where's that from?
That's Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, the atheist philosopher, said we are just lumps of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another, which is logical and consistent, but pretty miserable, to be honest. I think you're more than a lump of carbon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got another question about God's control in a sense. Does not Jesus' rule from the cross compare Moses holding up the snake on a cross in the desert and those who looked were saved? You might need to explain that second part of the question, but...
Yeah. So this thing about people were to look at the snake being held up when there's a plague and in Moses and all the rest of it. Constantine, by the way, thought that Jesus did rule from the cross because when he put the emblem of the cross on his soldiers' shields, they won every battle. So, but that's superstition. I don't think that's Christianity. I think the answer to the question is no. When Jesus was on the cross, he was not ruling. He was suffering the most abject humiliation. He made himself nothing. The idea that, if you've seen the Monty Python film Life of Brian, they have this idea of Jesus on the cross going, always look on the bright side of life. And it's just, and sometimes you do say that. You see Jesus on a crucifix, and there's this kind of beatific smile. And that's the opposite of what the Bible says. The Bible says that Jesus on the cross was so ugly that we couldn't even look at him. It's like the ultimate horror. And I don't think Jesus was ruling on the cross.
Okay. All right, there's a comment here, the Davidsons are from the Orkneys. So yeah. There we go. Okay. For those who don't believe or doubt about the resurrection of a Jesus, are they really treated as Christian? If yes, how? If not, how? So it's talking about the nature of belief in the resurrection and how central or otherwise that is to Christianity, because some people have said, well, I don't need to believe in the resurrection, but I'm still a Christian. So I think that's where the question's going.
No, if you don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, then you're definitely not a Christian, in the same way as if you don't believe that Shane Warne is the greatest bowler ever in the history of cricket, you're not a cricket fan. No, that's maybe not a good analogy, but there are things that there are lots of people who say things and who will identify with particular groups, but if they don't act upon it, so it's impossible to be a follower of Christ if you think that Christ is dead and there's nothing to follow. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you mean by Christian, so I did bizarrely, yesterday I was in South Sydney doing some door-to-door work, and it was fascinating because there were quite a lot of religious people. And they went, no, I'm religious already, I'm good. Or they would say, I'm not religious, I'm good. And I'm saying, everyone, this must be a paradise to live in because everyone here is good. And I was going, no, you're not. If you're religious, Jesus says you're not good. And if you're not religious, you're blind. Except, I had fun with them. But this idea that people have got, so what they were identifying, there's one lovely door I knocked on, and this lady came and she said, oh, I'm from Macedonia. And I said, that's great, free Macedonia and all this kind of stuff. She said, everyone in the world, she said, every people in the world are fine, apart from the Greeks. And I said, I said, the Greeks? She said, yeah, our next door neighbors are Greek. I went, okay, this could be fun. So I knocked on the Greek door and said, hi, what do you think of the Macedonians? But it's interesting dynamics. But the point about it was that both for her and actually her neighbor, religion was a matter of cultural identity. To be Greek is to be Greek Orthodox. And I think the Bible challenges that. It's like people might say, oh, I'm white Australian, so therefore I'm Christian. No, you're not. You can be lots of different things. It doesn't make it like that. And I think to identify as a cultural Christian, that's one thing, but a real Christian is someone who believes that Jesus rose from the dead. That's another.
Well, there's a question that follows on directly from that, from Sydney. Some religions seem to be tied to ethnicity, which is just what you were saying.
Yeah.
Would that suggest implicit compulsion, whereas a Christian belief is true Christian belief is not tied to any markers? I think that means ethnic markers or heritage markers.
Well, listen, Christian belief can be tied to ethnic markers. So my brother, for example, went to work in the southern US, and he wasn't interested in church, but he was an agricultural salesman, and he was told, you better go to church or you won't get business. So there was a little bit of compulsion in that. There can be an aspect of that. And I'm not denying that the ethnic aspects aren't important. So I remember a Middle Eastern guy I met, and he became a Christian. And at one point, I never forget him. He phoned up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he said, there's two things I want. I've become a Christian. And he'd been Muslim. I said, I want two things. He said, well, what are the two things? He said, I want a bacon sandwich, and I want all my family to be baptized. And for him, it was inconceivable that he would become a Christian and his family wouldn't. And I think that's actually fairly biblical. But I think in terms of ethnicity, your race does not determine what you believe. So actually, the 21st century Christian is much more likely to be Chinese than to be European, much more likely to be African than to be American. So the idea of Christianity as being a Western white religion, it's just wrong. I mean, it's wrong anyway. All the pictures you got in Jesus in a Sunday school book of looking like he came from Scotland were just awful.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jesus was a Jew.
Well, Jesus was a Palestinian, so at the very least, he would have had dark skin. Yeah. And it's almost without question. Well, it is without question. The early church flourished most in what we now know as Turkey and Greece, but also in North Africa.
Okay. That's where Augustine was, is that? Yeah. That's where he's from. We have a question about the resurrection. Why does Paul say, if the resurrection doesn't or didn't happen, you are still in your sins? Yeah. What's the link between sins being forgiven and the resurrection? Well,
he says this. What he says is this. Basically, Christ died for our sins. If Christ didn't die and wasn't raised, so you go to the book of Romans right at the very beginning where he says he was proved with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, then his death didn't work, so you're still in your sins. He also adds something which is even more. He says, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we are of all people to be pitied. So actually, those of you who might say, you are crazy or you're wasting your life, yeah, that's true.
If it's not true.
If it's not true, yeah. So one of the worst things are people who go, well, it's really sweet that you believe what you believe and you believe what you want to believe and everyone's entitled to their belief. No, they're not. Everyone is, well, they're entitled to believe what they want, but I'm also entitled to say that they're wrong or they're nuts. And Paul does it for us. He says, if this is not true, then we are of all people to be pitied.
So you're saying that Christianity puts its neck on the chopping block and says, if this is not true, if it's not historically accurate, there's no point.
So people will say to me, David, if evolution was proven to be true, would that destroy your faith? And I go, no, because I don't think the Bible, is a science textbook as such. Now I'll get into all kinds of trouble for saying that, but I really don't. I mean, it's not I think Genesis could accommodate that. That's not the issue. I think there are a lot of questions and problems, but and then they say to me, well, what would destroy your faith? And I said, well, give me the bones of Jesus. That's it. I'm done.
All right. We just got time for one more question, and they've both come through in the text, and that is the name of the book about the Amish, or the film, and also the name of the Viking saga. We've got some.
Okay, it was a documentary called How to Get to Heaven in Montana.
Okay, How to Get to Heaven in Montana. Yes.
It wasn't a book as far as I know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And the Viking saga.
Oh, the Orkney Inga saga. That's
Just say that more slowly.
Orkney Inga saga. It's that basically we've got a lot of Viking tales from that time. I mean, I studied Scandinavian history for a while. Vikings by the way, are completely fascinating. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien argued that the great Viking tales were like the great tales from throughout the world, that all these stories point to one ultimate story. And it is absolutely fascinating that when Christianity went to the Vikings and said, look, guys, it's probably a bad idea to go around, killing people. And I mean, okay, you get their land and you get everything, but there's a reason why, Valhalla and so on, this is not what it is. But there is some truth in what you're saying. There is a life beyond, there is justice, there is valor and so on. And so I find, to be honest, I find all ancient stories fascinating, and the Viking ones particularly so. By the way, if you watch the series Vikings I think it's on Netflix, it's actually remarkably accurate, very accurate in lots of things.
Okay, thank you. Well, please join me in thanking David for his amazing efforts in this last month